The Darwin Day has been celebrated with a public lecture since 2006.
Science, rationality, and humanism are worth celebrating because these three forces are drivers of change that make the world a better place. In contrast, the recent conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East are stark reminders that simultaneously there are other forces at work that threaten progress and human well-being.
Tonight's speaker, Eva Jablonka, was born in Poland in 1952, at a time when Europe was struggling to recover from horrific atrocities that targeted minorities. When she was 5, her family emigrated to Israel, where she had her home and academic career. She retired in 2020.
As academics, we are individuals who pursue new thoughts to where they lead us. Still, as academics, we are also citizens, and our work is organized in institutions. Nations and institutions have broader toolboxes at their disposal than individuals have. So we would like to thank Aktivister for Palestina, who organized the protest outside, for raising awareness of the role of the University of Bergen and Norway. Eva Jablonka has welcomed their protest and will take questions and discuss the situation in Israel and Palestine after the lecture. As academics, we need to speak up and we need to speak together.
In 2008, Jablonka initiated a petition to protest against the policies of the State of Israel when it was causing restrictions on the Palestinian universities at the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As academic, she wrote, "We see ourselves as having a duty to fight for the academic freedom of our Palestinian colleagues. We call upon the government of Israel to honor and implement the rights of freedom of movement and academic study and instruction in the State of Israel and the territories controlled by it. Academic freedom is not divisible and cannot be selective." The petition was signed by more than 400 academics across a range of universities and research institutions in Israel, not without debate. Eva Jablonka has been associated with the peace movement in Israel since 1981.
We invited Eva Jablonka to give tonight's Darwin Day presentation in February a year ago. 7th of October, Palestinian terrorists entered Israel and killed 1,139 people, of which 2/3 were civilians. In a response out of proportions, Israel's armed forces have killed more than 28,000 people on Palestinian territory. 2/3 of these were women and children. We ask you now to honor these horrible losses by joining us in a moment of silence.
At times when violence surges, diplomacy collapses and polarization is fueled by shallow misinformation, academics and academic freedom have an important role to play in continuing to discuss ideas and science and to point to hope and ways forward. Tonight, therefore, we meet as free individuals unconstrained by ethnicity, nationality, and religion, or institution. We are here because we want to celebrate science, rationality, and humanism. And because we are interested in hearing Eva Jablonka share with us her thoughts, developed over several decades on how consciousness began to evolve from its simplest forms to the exceptional role it plays in humans today.
Then Jarl will introduce Eva.
So we say here that Eva Jablonka is a professor of genetics. And that is the first thing we say, which is not true. And we say here that Eva Jablonka is a professor of genetics. And this is the first time I have to say to you today that this is not true. So she is a professor in the history of the sciences. And she is a professor at this, she was a professor, as you know, at this Kohn Institute for the History and Philosophy and Science and Ideas at the Tel Aviv University. And this Kohn Institute is a kind of an elite institute in Israel, which attracts and accepts only the very best professors. It is sort of like the SAR Center here, but it's not attracting the very best and brightest postdocs, but the very best and brightest professors, and they stay there for this long time. So these are the topics they work on in this institute, and she has been working on the history of biology, and she has, as a geneticist, she has also studied many topics in biology, and this has, for instance, led her to study epigenetics, which is the evolutionary, the changes that happens in an organism's genome after birth, or it can be inherited from the parents, but it's not the ordinary part of the genetic code. She wrote a book about this in 1995. In 2000, she wrote a book about animal tradition, which is a different kind of evolution. It is the evolution which happens because individuals learn from each other, the cultures and traditions that happen among animals. And this led her in 2005 to publish a book called Evolution in 4 Dimensions. One dimension of evolution is known to everyone. That is the genetic inheritance of kind of Darwinian evolution. The second dimension of evolution is the epigenetic factors. The third dimension is the social evolution that we learn from each other, some of us. And the fourth dimension of evolution is symbolism in human beings and what's happened with our own species. And much later on, she has written. So she's made an update of this book 10 years after the first volume came out. But now she's made a new book about the same topic: inheritance systems and the extended evolutionary synthesis. And the extended evolutionary synthesis is a kind of heretic in some very orthodox Darwinian circles, and she stands for it and bravely and works for it. So she and these heretics is that one shall not only think about genes in the Darwinian way, but all these factors together is what drives evolution. And then also she started something like 2005 to work with Simona Ginsburg on consciousness and evolution of consciousness. And you might think that the sensitive soul is some kind of a person who is a little bit shaky and out of balance, but the sensitive soul is Aristotle's concept of animals. Animals is defined by having, in his term, a sensitive soul. So she is discussing consciousness in this Aristotelian background. And then she's very recently then made a new book on the same topic, which is not as thick as this, but much thinner and with excellent illustrations by Anna Selskapet, who's also illustrated the front cover of the other books, but here is Anna Selskapet's artistic illustrations on every second page through the book. So this is the diversity of topics she's interested in. And you are here now to hear her talk about the evolution of consciousness. And tomorrow at 10 o'clock at the SAR Center, the Mikael SAR Center, she will talk about epigenetic inheritance and extended evolutionary synthesis. And if you think she's tired after giving 2 talks, she will then go on to take the 3rd talk, which will be at the Allrak Helsingør in the psychology department, where she will be the guest of the Brain and Consciousness group and talk about embodied AI and consciousness. But now, the Darwin Day. Welcome, Eva.
Do you hear me? Yes, good. Well, thank you very much for being here and for welcoming me in your beautiful city, peaceful city. And thank everybody. And I'm also very thankful to the students who came here, including the students who protested against what is going on in our region, the horrible war that is going on there. And they gave these flowers to me, and these flowers stand for peace, for justice, and for compassion. Let's hope. So it's a great honor to give a Darwin lecture. Darwin was very influential for me personally. Evolutionary biology is why, in the first place, I became a biologist. I became a biologist because I understood that evolutionary biology is a key for understanding many, many different things. Not just in biology, but in general. It's a very powerful tool of thought. What you see here is one of the pictures of Anna Zhirigovsky, and this is Darwin in the Galapagos. So it's a big responsibility to give a Darwin lecture for me. And I have to say that what I'm saying and the pictures that you will be seeing here are everything is collaborative work, really. We always work together, me and my students and my colleagues. And what you see here is Anna Zhirigovsky on the left, who did the pictures, and Simona Ginsburg, with whom I have been working on the evolution of consciousness, in the middle, and myself, as you see, more or less similar to whatever you see now, on the right. And I want to start with something that Darwin didn't want to talk about. There were 2 topics that Darwin refused to talk about and to write about. One was the origin of life, and the other one was the origin of mentality. And this is what he says in The Origin of Species. I must premise that I have nothing to do with the origin of the primary mental powers any more than I have with that of life itself. Why? Why? One of the greatest evolutionary biologists, not the only one, but one of the absolutely fundamental figures of evolutionary biology, doesn't want to think about these great problems. How did life originate? How did mentality, the ability to experience, not just to respond, how did it originate? What is going on? And it is particularly puzzling when you look at what Darwin was writing about, for example, about emotions, or about human evolution. When you're looking at the descent of men and selection in relation to sex, you see that he's very interested in the evolution of consciousness in humans and what makes up evolution of consciousness. But he's not interested, and he's not writing about the origin of mentality. He's also very, very interested in the expression of emotions in men and the animals. What is the function of the expression of emotions? How we can follow the evolution of the expression of emotions. So he's obviously very interested in mental life of animals and of human beings. Nevertheless, he does not talk and does not discuss the origin of mentality, nor the origin of life. Now, if you look at what Darwin actually wrote, not in his books, but in his letters, you see that he was not that he did think about it. He wrote to his friend Hooker, the botanist, that he's imagining the origin of life to start in a small little warm pond somewhere, some chemical reactions happening there and bringing this chemical, and somehow making from this complex chemistry something that can be called alive. But he didn't want to talk about it. In the same way, he was very interested in the origins of mentality, actually. And his young protege, George Romanes, he gave him everything that he wrote about instinct that didn't go into the origin, and encouraged him to explore the evolution of mentality, including speculations about the origin of mental states. Now, but he didn't do it himself. He was interested in it, but he didn't do it. And the question is why? Now, it's a difficult question, really, because I think it has a lot to do with the... First of all, it's a very, very, very difficult question. Because when you're thinking about the origin of life, or you're thinking about the origin of the ability to experience anything, to feel, you know, how can it's such a categorical, such a great leap, a quantum leap from the previous state. I mean, here you are, you have non-living creatures, and suddenly you have living creatures. It seems like a huge leap, a quantum leap. And it's not clear how you can bridge it, especially for somebody who thinks in an evolutionary, gradualistic kind of way. The same about mentality. How do you think? You know, you have all kinds of, let's say, creatures that respond to the environment in more or less complicated ways, but don't feel anything. And then suddenly you have animals that feel. Why? What's the big deal? Why do they have to feel in the first place? And what is happening? What is making them feel? These are very, very difficult questions. And it's not a coincidence that these are considered to be some of the most difficult questions in biology today. There is, about the origin of life, we have been working for, we, biologists, chemists, scientists in general, geologists, have been working for at least 120 years, more than that, but in a scientific kind of way. Thinking about it, doing experiments, there are a lot of labs that are doing origin of life, that are trying to figure out the origin of life, how complex chemistry can give rise to something that we can call alive. With the mental evolution, this was almost a taboo, a taboo subject for quite a long time. For a long time, people who were thinking about consciousness are using, as they called it, the C word. Yes, were thought to be charlatans, basically, or either charlatans or stupid or a combination of the two. Now, it's still a big question, and there are many, many people who are thinking differently about it. So, it's a very debatable question today, too. And first of all, before I start telling you what different people think, I just want to say what I mean by when I'm using this C word, the consciousness. So I mean the most basic, non-reflective. You don't have to reflect about your feelings or about your thoughts. Non-reflexive, subjective feeling that includes extroceptive, that is visual, olfactory, auditory, experiences, interoceptive, internal experiences like pain, hunger, and thirst, and bodily position, proprioceptive experiences. So all the experiences that we feel, and this is what I mean by basic consciousness. Now, when people are trying to think about it, there are many, many ideas that you will meet in the literature. For example, people will say only humans are conscious. That's it. And this is because for consciousness you need language. There is philosophers used to think like that, but there is a smaller and smaller minority of they shrink. The number of people who think like that shrink. Most people think that it's not only humans that are able to have phenomenal experience, to experience something, like pain, like pleasure, like having perceptions, but other animals too. But which animals? So some people say only mammals and birds. For example, there is a very famous theoretical psychologist called Nicholas Humphrey. in Cambridge who thinks that only mammals and birds can do it. Then there are people who think that all amniotes can do it, but only amniots. As, for example, reptiles, birds, and mammals, but not fish. Amphibians, yes, and amphibians no, and invertebrates also no. So only reptiles, birds, and mammals. Why? They have all kinds of arguments. I will not go into that. Then there are people who think all vertebrates, including fish, can feel, and this also includes cephalopods, like squids and octopus and cuttlefish. And then there are people who think, well, we have to increase it. All vertebrates, yes, some arthropods, and some mollusks. Mollusks, usually the cephalopods, the octopus, the cuttlefish, and the squid. And then there are people who think that actually consciousness is a primitive of life, that once you have a living being, it is also sentient. It also feels, in some minimal sense, but it does. And then there are also people who think that actually all matter is sentient in some sense, that it is a primitive of physics, not only a primitive of biology, but a primitive of physics. It's something like energy. Somebody like Chalmers, David Chalmers, the philosopher, thinks that this is the case. Right? So there are many, many opinions, and people are arguing very heatedly about this. One thing that we realized that is missing from a lot of these discussions when we first came to consider this question was that there was no good evolutionary approach to it. And this is what we tried to do. We said, well, let's have a think about how something like that could evolve. And the first thing that we thought was that we assumed is that consciousness evolved. So we didn't think that consciousness is a primitive of life, and we didn't think that consciousness is a primitive of physics. We assumed that at some point in the history of life, in the history of living organism, consciousness emerged. And the question was, how? How to think about a question like this? So actually, Darwin was helpful here, as well as Aristotle in a different way, because Darwin, as you remember, avoided the question of the origin of life and the origin of mentality, because in both cases there was this quantum leap. There was something about it that was very, very... It was a different mode of being, basically. Suddenly you have this leap into a different mode of being. So, and since we realized that there is quite a lot of literature on the origin of life, we thought, maybe we can learn something from the literature on the origin of life and take some principles of thinking, some of the principles that people used in order to advance their own ideas into the origin of consciousness. This was the idea. Let's see if there is some kind of methodological way of using ideas from the origin of life and importing them into ideas about the origin of consciousness. So we looked at the theories of origin of life, and we found one that was very helpful to us, because it was something we could work with. And it was a theory developed by a Hungarian chemist, organic chemist called Tibor Ganti, who is not very well known in among the circle of people who are not doing origin of life research. He was Hungarian, and so, he wrote in Hungarian. He was only translated in 1987, and very few people read it. And but he's considered now to be one of the fathers of system chemistry. Now, and Ganti was trying to understand to understand minimal life. He was trying to figure out what you need in order to identify something as alive. So what he did was he compiled a list of capacities that are minimally sufficient for characterizing life, the mode of being he was interested in. So he looks at the whole literature on this huge subject, and he collects all the things that most people, the best of the best, consider to be very relevant to the origin of life. And then he says, well, all right, this is a list. It's like a shopping list. Very helpful, but it's only a beginning. Now what he did was specify the relations between these different capacities, these different items on the list, right? And then what he did was to identify one property such that when we find evidence of it, we have evidence that the major transition to life from non-life to life have come to completion, that it is complete, that this is minimal life. And this thing we called the evolutionary transition marker. He didn't call it that, and a lot of what I'm saying here is a little bit of a reinterpretation of Ganti, but it doesn't matter. He was basically saying this kind of things, that these ideas were also developed by two biologists, Ernst Statmery and John Maynard Smith, both of them evolutionary biologists. Now, if we can find this transition marker, this diagnostic property that means that the transition has gone into completion, then we can reverse engineer from this the system that enables it. And then we can understand the dynamic architecture of this system. So this is what we did. So we took these ideas and we said, well, let's apply it now to consciousness. So the idea is this. You have this list of capacities. You see the lady here? Yeah, so at the bottom you have the list of capacities. And there is an agreement that when you have this list characterizes a certain mode of being, let's say life, or consciousness, or rationality. This is also a very special mode of being, ours, for good or bad. And then we try to find something, the transition marker, evolution transition marker, that if it is present, the whole list has to be present, right? It's a diagnostic of the whole list. And this is the transition marker, and this marks the presence of the mode of being that we're interested in. It's not a very complicated exercise in logic. But this is what we tried to do. This is the kind of, it's not logic, this is the methodology that we used. Okay, let's see if we can do it. Now, when Ganti was doing it, in his list he had maintenance of boundary, so you have to have some kind of closure, metabolism, stability, information storage, regulation of the internal milieu, of whatever it is that is stored in the entity, growth, reproduction, and irreversible disintegration, which we call death. And he suggested something that we call the evolutionary transition marker, and this is something that he called unlimited heredity. If a system has a capacity to form lineages of open-ended length, varying in open-ended ways from the initial system, this is unlimited heredity. And the DNA system is an example of such a system. And if you have a system like that allows you a huge range of variations, of course it's not unlimited in the mathematical sense. It is unlimited in the practical sense. There are so many variations that you just can't, more than the stars in heaven. Of course there is a limit. But if you have this, then you can reverse engineer from this capacity to all the other capacities that have to be in place for this unlimited heredity system. For example, something like DNA to be in place. So this is the idea. You have a list, and you have unlimited heredity as the evolutionary transition marker, which is a marker of a living system. And the idea is that if you are beginning to think what you need in order to have such unlimited heredity system, you come to something like a protocell. I will not go into his analysis, and he created a little model of this that shows that all the capacities that are in place, that he noted, are actualized by a very, very simple protocell. Okay. So we said, let's do it. So we spent some happy years. I mean, the whole project took us 12 years of work. More. more. But since we sort of decided, okay, we probably have to write a book and not a series of papers, so we went into the literature on consciousness, and we looked at what philosophers and psychologists and cognitive scientists and neurobiologists wrote about it. And we came to a consensus list that most people, if they found a creature with these capacities on a different planet, would think, well, it might be conscious, it might feel something, and let's treat it with respect. So what are these properties that a lot of people agree about that are characteristic of a conscious mode of being? They are to some extent overlapping, which is good because it's a system property. So it's good that they're slightly or partially overlapping. So one thing that people talk about is binding or unification. When we perceive something, for example, an apple, or we perceive a green apple, perceive it as coherent, as green, as round, as smooth, all together. There is a kind of unity in our perception. The other thing is global accessibility and broadcast that is central to some origin of consciousness, some consciousness theories. This is the integration among sensory, motor, memory, and value subsystem that enable the system to make discriminations and generalizations. And also selective amplification and exclusion. There must be a lot of constraints on the system, which are inbuilt in the dynamics. And selective attention, the ability to select, shift, and maintain attention is one of them. Only one of them. There are many constraints. There is something that philosophers call intentionality, which is they have this ugly word aboutness. Yes, what they mean is basically mapping, representation. It's not just that we integrate information; we represent the world. It's not simple integration. It's not like 1 + 1 + 3 = 5. It's something else. It's actually you map the world, both the world outside you and the body. Temporal integration also. Goal-directed behavior that is based on representations and predictive. Yes, temporal integration means that things have a temporal depth. So when the present for us is not an infinitely small point between past and future. It has some duration. We experience it as a duration, right? And this is something that was very central to many theories of consciousness or thinking about consciousness, phenomenologists, for instance, starting with William James. And then flexible evaluative systems and goals, goal-directed behavior, based on representations of learned predictive relations among actions, outcomes, and rewards. And this must be anchored in past and in what happened in the past and also in what is happening in the present. And this allows flexible, prioritized physiological context. And then we have to have some kind of embodiment. People are talking about embodiment, implementation of action in a proactive body with object-oriented spatial cognition that requires many degrees of freedom, not just one action, possibility of one action, but many actions. And self-other distinction from a stable perspective. It's a sense of one's own body as distinct from the world. For example, we can feel the difference when we are tickling ourselves and somebody else is tickling us, right? This is a classic example of that. Okay, now, if we met a creature with all these things in another planet, we would think there is but it's a chance that this creature has some kind of experiencing. We wouldn't be sure, but we will give it a big benefit of doubt, right? So, okay, and this is something that a lot of people from many disciplines were talking about. And then we said, okay, how can we operationalize this? I mean, we can't go to every creature and ask it for the list. We have to have some kind of criteria, some kind of diagnostic, some kind of diagnostic transition marker, right? This is what we were talking about. And we looked at a lot of things, spent a lot of time and wasted a lot of time and went into all kinds of strange holes. But in the end, we found a mode of behavior, a way of learning that we thought is a good transition marker. And we called it unlimited associative learning. It's unlimited in the same sense that unlimited heredity is unlimited. It just allows a lot of, it's very combinatorial. Now, what do we mean by this? We have to operationalize it. We have to work with it. What does it mean? It means that an animal has to be able to distinguish among novel composite patterns of stimuli and of actions. So, for example, a peahen, for example, can discriminate between males on the basis of all kinds of subtle differences between it. Yeah, she said, this is better than this. This male is nicer than this. Or this dance is more beautiful than this dance, and things like that. So the ability to discriminate between things that are composite, that are made up of many different organized stimuli that are slightly differently organized, is one thing. Can you do discrimination learning? Yes or no? The other thing is, can you learn if there is a gap, a time gap, between some kind of neutral stimulus and the reinforcement and the prize that you get? Or do they have to coincide? If you can learn, even if there is a small time gap, this is one of our criteria. Why it is one of our criteria, I can answer when the questions come. But there are good reasons for thinking that this is important, and it, of course, opens up a range of possibilities of learning that would not be open otherwise. The other thing is to be able to be flexible about the value of what you learn, of the predictor of good or bad. So something can be good in one environment and not very good in another environment, or can be very bad, actually, in a third environment. And you also don't have just one thing that impinges on your physiology and on your behavior. There are many things that happen. You have to prioritize them. You have to decide what is more important. So you have to have a system that allows for that. And manifests what is called, in the literature of behavior, second-order learning, that is, learn on the basis of what you have learned already. So what you have learned already can become almost innate, developmentally innate, not genetically innate. Yes, but developmentally innate, it's an automatic thing. And then you can learn on the basis of this. This is already a reinforcement. You can use it as a reinforcement, and then you can have a predictor of that. And this allows generalization, this allows long chains of action and things like that. Now, this may seem to you like a very demanding list. You have to have discrimination learning and learn across a time gap and change your values and do second-order learning. But when we looked at the literature and we asked who has it now, all these things, by the way, they assume the whole list that I was talking about. You cannot have these capacities without actually assuming that the creature can do some binding, that there is a flexible value system, that there is some kind of duration to time, and so on and so forth. I will not go into the justification of each of them, but you can't. That's why it's a good transition marker. So fine, we have a transition marker. Now, so here it is. Yes, here is the list. And that our transition marker is unlimited associative learning, which we call UAL for short. And it requires all these things. It requires mapping. It requires integration of sensory features and motor kind of body image. It requires exclusion of irrelevant signals. It requires a dedicated memory system that stores event representations. It requires an evaluation system that is flexible and can prioritize things. And it needs an ability to distinguish between body-generated and world-generated identical stimuli. Good. So we have something that we were at least satisfied with as a marker. And this is the outline of the architecture that we were thinking about. We need something that brings together an integrated sensory stimuli, integrated motor stimuli that map the body, a value system which is flexible, and a memory system. And all this have to come together. This is just a little caricature, of course. It's a very, very simple model. We have a slightly more complex model, but we don't have a computational model, by the way. I have to confess to that. We didn't make one. Okay. So this is the basic architecture, very, very, very basic architecture of the model. And it's a very general and descriptive model. And the important thing about it, it allows goal-directed behavior that enables recognition of predictive relations between composite, made of many parts, sensory inputs, action patterns, outcomes, and rewards. These are the things, these are the elements. Okay, so then we could answer a question, and we found it very good to think in these terms because we can answer a question like, what is the function of consciousness? If you accept that unlimited associative learning is a good marker for minimal consciousness, because you see, reflection was not part of our list of capacities. If you accept that, then all the functions of unlimited associative learning are also the functions of consciousness. And when you think about the world that you see, the complexity of the world, the fact that we see things like very complicated flowers that are selected and visited by creatures like the dragonfly here, makes sense. Whereas it also makes sense that plants that are pollinated by wind have no sweet nectar, and they're white, like this one, right? Why? Because the ability to discriminate between different flowers is something that the wind does not have, but the dragonfly does. So we can make sense of a lot of patterns in the world and say, well, this is the result, actually, of the capacity for unlimited associative learning, which includes all these things, among them discrimination learning, and it is the reason that we have the world, this rich world that we see here. And this is another example. Darwin, by the way, since we're talking about Darwin, was thinking that sexual selection by mate choice is a very good marker of mentality. He didn't say it in these words, but he did say that animals that have the ability to choose mates, and discriminate between mates, have a mental state. And he described them as joyful and jealous and, all kinds of words that we would be very careful about using. Okay, so then we asked ourselves, fine, we have a list of capacities that animals can do. We have a large literature about learning, right? Let's look at this literature, 150 years of work on learning in all kinds of animals. So who can do UAL? Which animals? And then we found out that vertebrates can do it, including fish. Some arthropods can do it. This includes some insects, not all arthropods, and about a lot of groups we don't have any knowledge, or very little knowledge. And we have to accept that I'm just talking about what we know, not about what we don't know. And some crustaceans, decapod crustaceans, and some mollusks, the cephalopods, the octopus, the squid, the cuttlefish. Well, that was very nice. So we could say something. I want to stress, we don't say who does not have. We can't say who does not have consciousness. We can only say the positive thing. We can say this ones, according to our criteria, if you accept them, do. Okay? It's a positive kind of claim. Okay, so these are the ones. Once we know that we are looking at this kind of capacities, like the capacities for discrimination, and so on, and we look at these creatures, we can ask, do these creatures have a nervous system that can actually support these functions? Yes or no? And yes, they do. I know that you're very interested in fish. I want to tell you that fish tick all the boxes of UAL. Now, so we looked at vertebrates, at insects' brains, and at cephalopod brains, and we found that they have the supporting structures very different in each brain, but all of the supporting structures for these capacities exist in these brains. And this is a very interesting figure which shows the functional similarity in the insect brain and in the mammalian brain, which is amazing because they are completely different brains. And nevertheless, the relationship between very fundamental structures and that are responsible for processes of learning and memory and so on are surprisingly similar. What it means evolutionarily is open to debate. And now we looked and thought, well, if we know what the supporting structures is, we don't have behavior doesn't fossilize, but brains sometimes do. So let's look at brains and see when these structures first appeared. If these structures show us when UAL appeared, and if UAL is a marker of consciousness, we can learn when consciousness first appeared. And what we found was that it appeared at least twice. It appeared first in the Cambrian, in arthropods, and in vertebrates. And the second time it appeared 250 million years later in the cephalopod mollusks. So this, with the stars there, are the ones that the light came up. And we argued that not only did associative learning, and especially unlimited associative learning, evolve during the Cambrian, but it was also the driver of the Great Cambrian, one of the drivers, not the only driver, of course, one of the drivers of the Great Cambrian explosion. It led to a lot of antagonistic and cooperative arm races and feedbacks, which can explain the Great Explosion. Now, a lot of people would agree with this more or less, and would say that. And more people are beginning to think that, yes, it's not just humans, it's animals, and it's probably not just birds and mammals, but others as well. And here is something from 2012. This is the Cambridge Declaration about Animal Consciousness. It says, signed by neurobiologists, philosophers of mind, and psychologists, cognitive scientists, and others. The absence of a neocortex does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective states. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrate of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behavior. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess this neurological substrate. Okay, all I can say is that, and this is now, I think, widely accepted not by everyone, of course not, but it is beginning to be more and more accepted, and indeed, people are trying to extend the range of animals which can be considered conscious. How long do I have? Huh? Okay. Sorry. Okay. So I want to tell you just a few things. That this kind of, if we're right, and if unlimited associative learning is a marker of consciousness, this has all kinds of interesting predictions. One of the predictions is that experimental protocols, like a destruction, when you sort of there are all kinds of ways of destructing an animal when it is presented with something, so that it doesn't actually see it, or is not aware of seeing it. And there are all kinds of paradigms, like backward masking, if it means something to some people. So there are experimental protocols that switch off conscious perceptions in humans, but leave unconscious perception in place. Now, we predict that they selectively will switch off the ability for unlimited associative learning, while simpler forms of learning you can achieve them even unconsciously. So can be unconscious learning, but not this type of learning that we're talking about. And as far as we know, this seems to be the case. There are experiments on humans that suggest this, and there are also beginning to be experiments on other animals that suggest that this is the case. One is in rhesus monkeys, and there's somebody in Haifa in Israel who's doing some stuff on fish. I don't know what's going on there. There's also some stuff in Drosophila, by the way. Very interesting. They're not talking about consciousness there, but they can see that, for example, it cannot do this learning with a time gap when it is distracted, whereas it can do other things. It can do simpler kind of learning when there is an overlap. This it can do even when it is very distracted. Very interesting stuff. And there are other predictions as well. I don't think I have the time to go into them, but for example, some brain damaging, we predict that it will not allow the animal to learn by UAL, by unlimited associative learning, but it will allow it to learn in simpler ways. And we predict also that the neural correlates of subjective experience, whatever they will turn out to be in different animals, will also will correlate with unlimited associative learning. And this is just part of... Now, what I was describing to you is a very, very general model. And it's a very general descriptive model. And it has a lot of... it is based on behavior, mainly, also to some extent on neurobiology and cognitive biology, but it is the main thing, our marker is a behavioral marker. So one of the things we did was to look at dominant theories of consciousness that are based on neurological kind of arguments and on neurological kind of data. And one of them is something that is called the global neural workspace theory, which was developed by Changet, Dehaene, and their colleagues in France. And this theory of consciousness has all kinds of assumptions regarding brain organization and brain dynamics that are necessary. And they based this theory on humans, on human consciousness. So they were looking at humans, and they found, not very surprisingly, that the neocortex is very important. Of course, we have a neocortex, other creatures don't. For example, birds don't have a neocortex, and fish don't have a neocortex. So what we wanted to see was to look at their assumptions and then see how these assumptions work for creatures that do not have a neocortex, that these capacities are implemented in different structure. So this are the two figures here. One is the unlimited associative learning little toy model, and the other one is a kind of representation of the kind of things that you need for the global neural workspace theory. And what is nice and the reason that we chose this theory, among other things, is that there are a lot of similarities in terms of the kind of inputs that you need in order to have something like consciousness. You need sensory inputs, you need motor inputs, you need the kind of value inputs, you need memory, and they think that you also need attention networks. We don't. We think you need attention very much, but you don't need specialized attention networks in simple organisms. Anyway, there was enough similarity there. So we looked at fish to see what we know about fish, and this was done with Oriane Sachs, who is a student of mine. brilliant student of mine, and we looked at the case of basal-jawed fish, and which, as I said, there is evidence that they can implement unlimited associative learning. So as far as we are concerned, they are conscious in a minimal kind of sense. And then we said, okay, what do we find when we look at this fish? What are the kind of criteria that they are using in terms of the dynamics of brains, of conscious brains, implemented? And where is the global workspace? Because in our case, the global workspace is the neocortex. Where is there? They don't have a neocortex. So where does it happen? And what we found was something that we didn't expect. We found that it seems that the memory system, which in us is the declarative memory system, the hippocampus. In fish have a hippocampus homologue. It's called HH. And the hippocampus homologue seems to play a dual role. It is both a memory system, as it is in us, but it also plays the role, it has two functions. It also plays the role of a global workspace. Everything comes there and goes back to other places after, and there's back and forth interaction there all the time. The back and forth interactions are a general feature of brain dynamics. Okay, so this is the brain. And I will not go into the arguments. I mean, we have a paper about this, if somebody wants to read it, with a lot of data. But what it means is that we have to change slightly both our model, our unlimited associative learning model, when we think about fish, as well as, and they, I mean the global neural workspace people, have to change their model when they think about how they represent the coming together of things into the general workspace. So it's nice. It means that we have to change and to take into consideration new kind of a new way of representing the ideas, but it doesn't change the core, neither of our ideas nor of theirs. And there are again predictions of that. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so I would like to say something about humans. But before that, I just would like to say that what we know about we can check this kind of assumptions, for example, by looking at different animals coming out of anesthesia, animals that don't have neocortex, coming out of anesthesia and how they come out of anesthesia and compare them to mammals. We can do a lot of things that can give us a good idea, that can sort of examine whether or not that either support or refute the kind of model that we have in mind. Okay. And we also think that there will be very simple animals we will be able to show that they are subject to illusions, that they perceive that you can trick them with all kinds of illusions. Okay, but before I go to humans and say something about them, I want to say that there was no jump from fish to humans, right? I mean, there was a lot of evolution was going on, and one of the important stages was that what we call imaginative consciousness, and this is when past memories and future possibilities can be consciously experienced. Not just that they can sort of affect behavior and affect present behavior, but that we can feel something about the past, feel something about the present, about the future. For example, we may be afraid of bombs and of other way of things like that. And there are certain groups of animals, both birds and mammals, some birds and mammals that we know have these abilities, imaginative abilities. Now, we have something that is very unique, and we think is also a different mode of being. We are very, very different creatures from others. Of course, there is an evolutionary continuity, and there are many similarities between us and other animals, but there is a big jump. And this is our symbolic capacity. This is the fact that our values are not just what is nice or not nice for us in the terms of pleasure and displeasure, in the sense that, we satisfy basic existential needs. We have abstract values. We have the good, the true, the beautiful, are very important values for humans. We can die for them. And this is something that other animals don't have. And these values are embedded into human existence. And this is due to the ability of our ability not only to think, to imagine, but to communicate through symbols about the imagined. So the most powerful capacity for that is the linguistic capacity. Language, as my friend and colleague Daniel Daw said, is a technology for the instruction of imagination. And it is, we can talk about the imagined, and the imagined is shaping us as a species. And this is a great person, unknown usually in the West, unfortunately, Brazilian psychiatrist, Nice da Silveira, who I'm giving her as somebody who is an example of a human being, a compassionate human being, who she did not agree to do lobotomies in the early 20th century. She disagreed to do shock kind of therapies and insulin injections and things like that. She used art therapy. And she was a great lady. So this is the best of the human. Now, I want to go back to the idea that we are the symbolic species is not our invention. Yes, it's Ernst Cassirer, who was a very famous German philosopher, thought that this is what defines humans. He said that we live in a different dimension of reality when we are compared to other animals. He said that we have new values that drive our life decisions. And we're driven by the symbolic. As I said, by the good, the beautiful. And we also need the symbol-based agency, which we call freedom. And if we don't have freedom, we rebel, sometimes in terrible ways. And we live by this kind of things. Now, again, you can say, well, what led to this? How did humans become this creature, this kind of symbolic creature, what Aristotle called a creature with a rational soul? He didn't mean rational really just being able to do geometry. I mean, he meant the ability to think about thought, to reflect, and to communicate about it. And what we know about human evolution is that our ancestors already, and what we know about ourselves, had extraordinary levels of cooperation, highly developed theory of mind. We have. I mean, looking at you, I can assume what you know that I know, or that you think that I know, and so on and so forth. A few steps further. We have very, very powerful mechanisms of group bonding. We have a lot of social conventions, social emotions, like guilt, shame, embarrassment, pride. And we have a lot of moral norms. We have complex, sequential, and socially learned imitation-based practices. We humans have autobiographical memory. We can go back in time and we can imagine ourselves, we can remember what happened to us. We can tell our life story. And we have symbolic language. And what we suggest is that symbolic language, the evolution of symbolic language, is the evolutionary transition marker for humans. And I mean, once we have it, all these things, all the other things which already exist in our ancestors have become very, very powerful. And this, and these capacities, all of these capacities, come with a kind of basic passion for understanding, curiosity, and tendency to seek and find relations between things. We are not the only ones. Other animals do it too. But we have a very, very, very strong tendency to see meaning in things. You remember Hamlet sort of pointing to the clouds to Polonius and saying, there is a weasel in the cloud. We see weasels in the cloud. We see all kinds of things. And we need, and it means also that we have to have very powerful ability to control and influence, control both to suppress but also to excite our own emotions. We have a certain ability of controlling our emotions which other animals don't have. They do have to some extent, but not to the extent that we have. And this leads to our unprecedented creativity, and also to our unprecedented cruelty and the capacities for dissociating our emotions from and justifying horrors as we see in the current wars and the current conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Thank you.
So thank you, Eva.
Sorry.
For pulling us through the evolution of consciousness. Now we have a bit of a trade-off. We have to be out of it. So I'll be organizing the discussion here, when we have to be out of here by 6 o'clock. And also the last chance to get a signed copy of your books is 6 o'clock downstairs. So we have to trade off the two elements there, I believe. And also there will be a chance to have a discussion with Eva afterwards, whatever.
If you want to talk politics.
Yes, you will also have that. But let's start now with the science, and I'm sure with this lecture there must be a number of burning questions out there in the audience. And we have a microphone running here, so if you have a question for Eva, please raise your hand. There is.
So I would like to start with your definition of consciousness. And the main part that I remember is a subjective feeling, which kind of assumes that there's someone feeling there. And this means that this entity should be self-aware in some sense. And then I wonder, is self-awareness part of your concept there? And how do you distinguish then consciousness from self-consciousness? And maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It comes up sometimes because I think that the point about self-awareness is that we use it in two senses. The one is that there is somebody who actually senses. There is an animal that has pain. But the other one is that there is an animal who thinks that it has pain and considers whether this, and has ideas about this pain. Now, the first sense of self-awareness, the first one, that there is somebody who feels a pain and that therefore there is a someone, doesn't mean that you have metacognition. So when we're using, so we're talking about self, and we're talking about the some kind of minimal self that you can have, in a sense, that also Damasio is talking about, and other people are talking about, other scientists, other people who are dealing with this subject are talking about. But we're not talking about metacognition, about the necessity for higher order thoughts. We don't need that. A baby doesn't have higher order thoughts. Nevertheless, a baby has a very good capacity to feel pain. So this is what we're interested in. Now, in order to have this capacity, yes, there is a very complex, you need to assume that there is a very complex kind of representation of the body already. And that there is this ability that I was talking about, that very simple animals have, to distinguish between the effects of a stimulus that comes from the world and the effect of the same stimulus that comes because of you are doing it. So, for example, a worm that is crawling on the ground is feeling the ground, but it doesn't have the reflex of freezing. It goes on because it is doing this crawling. On the other hand, if you suddenly take a worm and change the environment for it, make it feel this coarseness in the environment that before it didn't feel, it will freeze. Whereas if it is itself going through this coarse environment, moving from one type of environment to another, it will not freeze. So, because it is inhibiting the freezing reflex. So this is very, very elementary capacity of animals. Now, this capacity is not sufficient for consciousness. We think that in order to have consciousness, you have to also, to add to this, the capacity to learn, to incorporate learned things that were learned in the past. And then you need a more complex system. But this doesn't require metacognition. And a lot of people, like some theorists, second-order theorists, when they're saying you have to have metacognition. I don't think so. I don't think you need this. So it depends what you mean by a self-consciousness and self-image.
Thank you for a very nice talk and analysis. I have some questions. You said that some species that you take off the UAL on different species, low species. What about now robots and multimodal large language models? Do they tick off some of these boxes or increasingly do that?
Yes. So I'm going to talk about it actually tomorrow a little bit, because we don't have an unlimited associative learning capacity in robots. It's a very big, global intelligence, general global intelligence, things like that. It's a big thing in robotics, and people are thinking about how to do it, and they're thinking that if you put together all kinds of modules, you will be able to do it. Now, it's a good opportunity to clarify some things. I don't know if, I think that at the moment, robots are not ticking these boxes, okay? They are very, very far from it, more far than we think. They can do wonderful things that we can't do, accomplish fantastic things, but in very narrow domain, including the linguistic domain. The linguistic domain is one domain. Okay, they can do fantastic things, and they can also win a chess game easily against most of us, or all of us here. But that's it. And they can do and some of them can do more than one game, yes. And the language models are incredibly interesting, but they don't have this unlimited associative learning at all. They don't. Now, one of the questions is, there are two questions here. One is, okay, one day, let's imagine that one day they will have it. And then if we want to imagine it, we can ask, well, what does it require actually to have unlimited associative learning in robots? Does it, for example, require that they will not be made of hard parts, but that they will be made, but does it require a different kind of realization in matter? Maybe soft matter is necessary because it's pliable, because it's plastic, because some people think so. Does it require a hierarchical value system that has nevertheless some kind of common denominator, so that the parts and the whole interact in a way that is coordinated because they have some kind of very strong common denominator? Do we know what they are? Do we know how many levels they are? Do we need development, and what kind of development do we need? There is developmental robotics, for example. It's a branch of robotics. And people are talking about the need to learn sequentially, right, and develop behavior. Learn one thing, and at the top then another thing, and then another thing, and only in this way can you come to really, really complex behaviors. But then the question is, but do you also need morphological changes for that? Because morphological changes create constraints and affordances that otherwise wouldn't be in place. So there are a lot of open questions that most people just don't ask. But when you're taking seriously this UAL business, then you have to ask them, because it demands so much. So I don't know. I think if we'll have a robot or something like that that shows UAL, I will be very careful with it. I will try not to hurt its feelings.
Question here and then here.
And thank you so much for your speech first. It is super inspiring. I love it. And I'm just thinking about if the theory could be like a way of explaining why people start to tell story, or why people telling story. Because there's a strong theory nowadays about people experience the world. That like people's conscious and people's mind is in a sort of narrative way. We experience the world based on the event-based experience, and we predict the future based on the event we experienced in the past. So it is a very strong theory about our mind is structured in a way like the storytelling. So I'm just thinking of if the theory could be a way of explaining why our consciousness become the way like it is story-based. So why we predict the future based on the event that we recalled from the past.
Right. Now, there is quite a lot of work on that. And the people like Daniel Schachter in Harvard are doing a lot of work on the relationship between imagination in humans and episodic memory, right? And there is a lot of overlap between the areas in the brain that light up when you remember and the areas that light up when you plan for the future or you imagine the future. There is a lot of overlap between this, but not complete overlap. There are some areas that are slightly different. I don't think we understand fully these things. I think it's one of the things, imaginative consciousness in general, especially in humans, yes, the narrative aspect is extremely important. In other animals, I think that there is imagination, but I think that the narrative aspect is much less important. It's not that it doesn't exist. It probably does exist to some extent, but to a small extent. So there is no question that imagination is based on some kind of combinatorial putting together of memories and transformations of memories. And as I said, the best person to consult is the books of Daniel Schachter, who wrote a lot about it, and he has a very active lab that is dealing exactly with your question.
So one more question here. Maybe if anybody is burning to get a signed copy of a book, maybe you should sneak out and buy one and then come back with it.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As a master student, I'm at a very confusing point in my life right now because I'm reading a lot and I'm not understanding even more. So
I'm in the same place.
Yeah, and this is not so much an exemption from that rule. So the question I've had for the longest since you started talking today is if you have, during your search for answers in consciousness research, identified a key or a handful of key selection pressures that could lead to consciousness.
Look, if you accept that unlimited associative learning is a marker of consciousness, then the evolution of learning has been driving is what led to consciousness. It is constituted by this thing. It's not a byproduct. It is made up of these things in the same way that the liver is made up of cells. It's not a byproduct of its cells, right? It's made up of them. If you think that this is what happened, now, of course, I mean, learning is an incredible adaptation. And unlimited associative learning in general, but especially unlimited associative learning, is a quantum leap in adaptability. You adapt during your ontogenetic life. You don't need mutation selection, right? It's an incredible thing. I mean, and not every animal has it. There are some animals that learn, but they learn through non-associative learning, habituation and sensitization. That's also great. But once you have associative learning, a whole world opens up. And when you have this ability for generative, representational, cumulative, recursive learning that is what UAL gives you, well, the world, there's no limit to it. It's hugely adaptive. That's why it drove the Cambrian explosion, because once animals were able to learn, this drove a lot of adaptations in other animals. They're monsters, those animals who can learn. They can learn who is the predator, who is the prey. They can learn all kinds of things. They probably drive the ability to learn in other lineages, and so on and so forth. That's why we think it's one of the drivers. It's not the only driver. The Cambrian is a very, very complex era, but one of the important drivers of the Cambrian explosion. So it has a huge, if you have to accept that associative learning is unlimited associative learning is a good is a marker, of course. If you accept that, there's no problem.
Okay, Eva, maybe this is.
Yeah. You were saying there are two places that this ability was happening two times in the evolutionary history.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any examples of places where it has been lost?
I think so. Well, first of all, the brain has been lost during evolution several times. I mean, the brain is a great adaptation, but like many good things, it was lost during evolution when it was not necessary. So I think it probably was lost. We don't know when, but I think in arthropods that became parasitic, for example, if they had UAL and they became parasitic, they lost it, probably. But,
okay.
It's a good thing to have UAL on the whole.
Okay, one more question, and then maybe we should switch topic.
If you want.
Got a question. Do humans are equal in self-consciousness?
I'm a little bit deaf, so please, if you can talk.
Are humans equal in self-consciousness, according to you?
Yes?
Yes.
So, no, I didn't get it, sorry.
I said, are humans equal in self-consciousness or not?
Self-consciousness is to some extent, self-consciousness you mean by metacognition. I think we are all capable of it. Whether or not we exercise it, I think it's a cultural and social question. I think in some societies this is very, very important, and everybody goes to a psychologist. And in some societies, people spend less time about ruminating about their own. But we are all capable of it to a very large extent. We all have metacognition, all of us, every human being on this planet, except people who are, have brain damage or of all different types. But otherwise, yes, of course we are. But the level and the expression of this thing is culturally is very dependent on culture, how it is expressed. But the capacity is there and it is expressed at some level in all human beings.
Okay. Do
right.
you have any? Should we switch to?
Yes, we can switch. Yes. Anything you want. Anything you want. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So he was first. Yeah.
Thank you. My English is bad, but okay. What do you think about the political situation in Gaza today and the solution? Like, how can we solve this problem, but still ignore the fundamental problem of 1948 and 1947?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. What I think about the current situation is that the war has to stop. I think that the only solution to the current situation is a political solution. when you're talking about 1947 and now, and I think that the only viable solution for the conflict in the Middle East is a two-state solution, that there will be a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. This is what I believe is the only viable solution at the moment. One day, maybe, when we don't have nations anymore, there will be another better solution, but at the moment, this is the best. Now, how to implement it and how to deal with the Nakba of 1948 is a very good question, and a very difficult one, because we cannot go back completely, but we have to acknowledge our responsibility for what happened and to deal with it. There are many people have been breaking their head about this and trying to figure out how we can deal with it. As I say, I don't believe that you can displace Jews in order to replace the Palestinians back, because I don't think you can do one injustice by doing another. There are certain things, however, some compromises have to be made. But as I say, I'm not a politician and a specialist in this thing, but I can tell you that there are many ideas about it, and very serious people are taking it this question very seriously, and rightly so. Compromises will have to be made on both sides. I mean, there are very, very strong positions on the Palestinian side, there are very strong positions on the Israeli side, and some kind of compromise, which is never a happy compromise for everyone, will have to be made. I mean, we'll have to swallow a lot of frogs on both sides. But we have to do it. And I really think, and one of the things that we have to accept is that we Israelis, I'm talking as an Israeli now, that we have to accept that justice has to be made for the Palestinians, that they have to have their independence, they have to have their sovereignty, they have to have their freedom. How exactly to implement the two-state solution within the Green Line, with some compromises about this or that territory, I cannot go into these things. But I think this is and we have to respect the ideas and the feelings of the other side. And that has to be reciprocated also. And I think that the Palestinians, including people who are presently in the Hamas, have to accept us, Israelis, as something that can exist, that has the right for a state as well. I mean, this has to be, it has to be. Otherwise, there will never be peace. And I think that there is enormous and very understandable mistrust on both sides. Incredible one, and especially now what is happening in Gaza is a tragedy beyond description. So I don't know how it will affect the possibilities of peace. But if I'm thinking about the Second World War and about what happened in Germany, I mean, people were saying, that never will the Jews be able to look even in the eyes of a German. Now we have very good relations with the Germans now. Yes, I mean, it is possible for people to overcome the past and to build up some kind of honorable future. But we have to accept it and we have to do it. And at the moment, I must say, my government is not doing it.
One more.
Just a second. Sorry.
Thank you for the lecture. It was really nice to hear you speak about something you're very passionate about. And yeah, over to the political question. According to Israeli newspaper, the Haaretz, I'm sorry if I butchered that.
Haaretz, yeah.
You have signed a petition that calls for academic boycott of Israeli institutions. I was just wondering if that source is correct.
It's correct and incorrect. I mean, there was an academic, a friend of mine, Patrick Bateson, signed a petition, asked me what I think about the petition of academic boycott in 2002. when there was during the Second Intifada. And I said that I think that this is a legitimate action, that this is politically legitimate. I said that's all. I clarified afterwards that I don't think that academic. I will explain. I think that boycott is a legitimate political way of pressurizing. However, I think that if you are doing an academic boycott, and only an academic boycott, this is counterproductive. The academics are not the major target of a boycott. Okay, as an academic, I cannot say, well, you boycott everybody else, but not me. Of course I can't say that. Yes, I mean, this is ridiculous, and this is a kind of hypocrisy. But I think that if you want to boycott, you have to do it in a clever way and to target the kind of organizations and the kind of not people, not individual people, institutions that are really most responsible for it. Targeting just academics is silly, right? But as I say, because I am an academic, I cannot exclude myself. I mean, because this would be, crazy. So this is my position. I made it clear, but, you can talk.
Thank you for your insight. I just want to follow up on that. So when us students and professors, when we call for academic boycott, we want to add pressure, as you mentioned, but we do not want to add pressure on academics. We do not want academic freedom to be threatened. How can we, in the context of an academic boycott, ensure that professor-to-professor relationships can still continue? How can we have, we want an institutional boycott because Tel Aviv is directly involved in the brutal treatment of Palestinians, and they play a key role in the military and state level. So the institution is our target, not academics such as you. How can we take care of you and still go after the university? It's a very
difficult question, to be honest with you. It's I'm retired, right? But I do belong to Tel Aviv University. It's my academic home, yeah, and it's not one of the worst institutions in Israel. In terms, I mean, they can swallow people like me, and I have been very vocal about what I think. And they accept it, and I never had any problems from them. They also are doing all kinds of things in order to support Palestinian students and Palestinian staff at the moment. In Tel Aviv, I'm not talking about other universities. There are also other things that are unacceptable from your point of view, and I understand it completely. I don't know really how to answer you. I think that what you are trying to say, that you cannot really divorce me completely from my institution and from my country. You can't. It's very difficult because so you have to really think very carefully. For example, I'll give you an example from my own example. There is a university in Israel, not in Israel, in the West Bank, which is called Ariel University. It is in the West Bank. I think it is illegitimate to have a university there in the occupied territories, because they are occupied territories. They do not belong to us. We don't have the right to do this. I would not talk in this university, okay? And I said, made it clear. And, I made it clear. I am not going to talk there. If they invite me, I say, thank you very much, I'm not coming, right? This is my way of responding to this kind of situation. There are many other things that I would do. It's where you put your red line. I really cannot answer your question because I think it's really an impossible situation. But you have to be clever, strategically clever, to know how to deal with things like this. Where do you say, here, no. Yes, and it's but you will not find 100% tight justification for what you're doing. There will always be problems, in my opinion.
So Eva, I'm sorry to have to stop this discussion because we have to be out of this room in 10 minutes. And I think maybe we have something for you, Eva, towards the end.
Thank you very much for coming to us and giving this lecture. Thank you for coming here. This has been 2 very nice, fantastic hours of learning for us. The next opportunity for something which is not like this, but still maybe worthwhile, is tomorrow at 4 o'clock in Realfabygget. Then there is a discussion about can we afford the green shift by NTVA, Norsk Teknisk Naturvitenskapelig Akademi. 4:30. It's in Norwegian. There is some food from 4, and the meeting starts at 4:30. And then, Eva, in Bergen, if we are thinking about something useful, then of course underwear is the most useful.
It is.
But after underwear, the umbrella comes out as the first thing we think about. I know that you come from a different place. That
it's pretty cold in Jerusalem.
But please take this as a token that we think that this is the most valuable thing we can give to somebody.
Thank you very much. I will cherish this umbrella.